This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Today on CityCast DC, Washington is a pretty nervous place as the second Trump term begins. And a lot of the worry has to do with people's fears about their legal rights in a city that's not quite a state. Monica Hopkins, who runs the local chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union, has been tracking the threats, and she is here to talk about what's real and what isn't. Today is Tuesday, January 21st. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Monica.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So Trump is back as president, and a lot of people in local DC are concerned. He's made some very specific threats against the city, as have many of his Republican allies and colleagues in Congress. How worried do you think Washingtonians ought to be?
We should be worried. I don't think that we should let that worry consume us. We've had Trump 1.0 for DC, and when Trump was in office the first time, he made some of the similar sort of threats for DC, that he was, going to take over the police force, that he was going to take care of crime in the city, all of these things. And those are real threats. I think it's not really just Trump. We have to look at a more emboldened Congress as well. And so I do think that what we need to be aware of is sort of a federal desire to move some of Trump's policies. And where DC comes in is we could be the first place that he does some of these just to sort of hit news because of our lack of statehood and potential interventions.
So the lack of statehood's sort of core of that. Can we just get into some of the confusion about if we were sitting in a fully empowered state, we would sort of know what powers the federal government does or doesn't have over day-to-day stuff. But in DC, it's a much trickier thing. What powers does he actually have over Washington life that he might not have over, Baltimore or Philadelphia?
Yeah, this is what I like to call the civics lesson inside the civics lesson.
We love a good civics lesson here.
So, if people generally think about the federal law, and then they think about their state legislatures is the best way to start this conversation. There are certain things that state legislatures can just do, and it's within their authority. So in a state legislature, you pass a law, that law goes into effect, and it stays in effect unless they repeal it. The state does all these things. Well, in DC, we have a DC council. We have limited self-governance, but that law has to go through what is called a congressional review period, and Congress can overturn that law. Congress can say that DC residents can't even pass or spend any money on it, or Congress can just directly legislate on DC.
And there's this provision of home rule that allows the president to temporarily take over local police. How does that work?
There are provisions in there where he could take over the local police. It's for a period of time. So it would be a 72-hour period of time, and it has to be for a distinct purpose. Some of the times in which people might be familiar with of calling in the National Guard. The summer of 2020, the National Guard was called in to protect monuments. So unlike Philadelphia, our monuments are national monuments, so they're federal monuments, and the president has a right to protect those and also could sort of militarize our police for protection of certain things.
So on a practical level, you mentioned 2020. A lot of the concern, I think, is about how this sort of setup would affect protesting and free speech generally in D.C. Is that concern appropriate?
That concern is, of course, for us both as the ACLU and also here in DC as DC residents is a huge concern. I mean, both the militarization of law enforcement against protesters and protecting the right to protest here in DC, because we know it's not just DC residents, but we know people come to DC to protest. And so, really understanding how to organize legally what rights you have when interacting with law enforcement in DC, what law enforcement agencies you are actually interacting with, and how to document those things become really, really important at this time.
In a bunch of cities, including some fairly liberal ones around the country, there's been a lot of local legislating about protesting at people's houses and stuff like that, which is controversial. Yeah. DC has a local government that's been pretty good on free speech, free assembly issues, but this is the sort of thing that Congress could simply pass a law that would apply to the District of Columbia.
Well, Congress has in the past passed laws that apply to the District of Columbia. So Congress does have that right to say, we want to pass a law that DC would have to follow.
So that would presumably apply to abortion too. Trump's people told me over the summer that they were not going to come for abortion access in DC, but congressional Republicans may have a different agenda, and this kind of thing could lead to some horse trading. What can they do, and what could an organization like yours do in response?
Yeah, so you just articulated something that may actually protect DC, right? So Trump has said something and Congress had said something. And so this sort of separation of powers actually works in this way. Horse trading is one of them. But we saw that in previous sort of congressional times. They could come for abortion through the appropriations process because DC's budget is actually tied up in the appropriations process. DC has been very adamant about protecting that right, and so they could put riders on the budget. The ACLU, both in DC and nationwide, would fight for the right of individuals to retain that right.
But bottom line is, thanks to the Supreme Court, that right is not part of the U.S. Constitution.
Correct. It puts us in a tough spot also that even if we passed a ballot measure like some states like Missouri or Colorado or Arizona, we still are subject to congressional oversight. So that is the difference with us.
So a place where there's no daylight, as best I can tell, between the congressional Republicans and Trump is around this issue of sanctuary cities. DC prides itself on being a sanctuary city. What does that mean, and what might change?
Sanctuary city means that law enforcement won't immediately sort of like cooperate in the ways there needs to be procedures and processes in place. So what we saw across the United States were these programs like 287G that deputized local law enforcement to act as immigration officials. And so sanctuary cities basically say, like, we're not going to do that. Our law enforcement agencies are going to act as law enforcement agencies. We are going to ensure the rights of individuals who are within our cities. Immigration enforcement is, done by a federal agency. And so in DC, this is a real concern. What we have heard is in sanctuary cities, there are sort of these sensitive places also, like churches and schools and, places where folks gather and they should feel safe. People are asking questions. And I think that one of the things for us is really, knowing what your rights are under the law, particularly if you are an immigrant, if you are undocumented. DC has laws on the books that are important.
Which ones?
Like a standby guardian, which means that a parent of a child can actually appoint a standby guardian should anything happen to them. Mm-hmm. So, in mass deportations, if something like that were to happen and a parent was sort of rounded up, you would want at the school to know, like, this is the standby guardian who I've appointed. And then your child would go to the standby guardian, not to Child Protective Services or go into the foster care system in these situations. So I think that is one of the things that we have heard. There's a lot of concern. And I think it's a place where, the DC government can actually give some guidance and answer questions about what would happen.
NBC News reports that the Trump team is considering a DC area immigrant raid within the first days of taking office. What is ACLU doing, or what could you be doing to sort of prepare for and deal with that eventuality?
We have been talking to folks who are in the immigrant community, folks who are serving immigrant communities, about what are people's rights, what are schools going to do in the face of this. There aren't a lot of things that we might be able to do, but we may be able to provide guidance or direction to folks to know what their rights are in these situations. We have been encouraging the DC government to articulate what those rights are so that people can be prepared.
When it's cold outside, there is nothing better than a warmly lit restaurant and a cozy 3-course meal. And Winter Restaurant Week makes that actually accessible. It's happening this year from Monday, January 27th through Sunday, February 2nd. There are more than 250 participating restaurants this year, spanning over 70 different cuisines. So I love going to Restaurant Week because it's a chance to try out places that otherwise might be a little out of my budget. And there's something both fancy and relaxing about sitting down to a meal where you just pick from a curated menu at the start and then just let the courses come to you. Participating restaurants are offering brunch and lunch for either $25 or $35 per person. Dinners range from $40 to $65. Some spots even have drink pairings, which is very much right up my alley. Visit rwdmv.com to see restaurant menus and make reservations. Metropolitan Washington Restaurant Week is presented by the Restaurant Association, Metropolitan Washington, and Events DC.
Do you plan your vacations based on whether you can speak the local language? With Babbel, language no longer has to be the barrier. I'm David Plotz, the CEO of CityCast, and I went to Mexico City a couple of years ago with my girlfriend, who's a native Spanish speaker, so I just let her do all the talking, like all of it. I adored the city, and now I'm going to go back in a couple of months, but with my college roommates, who are a bunch of middle-aged men, none of us Spanish speakers. When I was younger, I might not have been bold enough to do that, but now I'm not anxious because Babbel has me covered. Thanks to Babbel, I know how to order a taxi, how to give directions, how to order in a restaurant, all the small and useful bits of language that make international travel easier. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons, handcrafted by over 200 language experts, get you to begin speaking your new language in 3 weeks or whatever pace you choose. And because conversing is the key to really understanding each other in a new language, Babbel is designed using practical, real-world conversations, especially the sort you need while traveling. Food, how to get places. Babbel's tips and tools are inspired by the real-life stuff you actually need when communicating. With a focus on conversation, you'll be ready to talk wherever you go. So I hope I'll see you in Mexico in a couple of months. Or, as we say, espero verte en Mexico en un par de meses. So let's get more of you talking in a new language. Babbel is gifting CityCast listeners 60% off subscriptions at babbel.com/CityCast. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/CityCast. Spelled BABBEL.com/CityCast. Babbel.com/CityCast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
So another thing a lot of people, neighbors, people who live here are worried about deals with sort of treatment of the federal workforce, which is obviously like a big part of our workforce in the district. There's been talk about, mass firings, that sort of thing, this moving people to Schedule F to make it easier to fire them. You lead the ACLU. Is that a civil liberties issue in your mind? And if so, is there anything legally that your organization could do to stymie those plans?
The way that we look at it is that this is sort of a due process issue, moving a portion of the federal workforce into sort of politically appointed roles could lead to arbitrary hiring, arbitrary firing of folks. And so that is really the portion and sort of the lane that the ACLU comes in on is that due process consideration.
So I think the biggest concern for a lot of people, though, is around home rule, which we've touched on. But I know that you have no doubt sort of gamed out scenarios and what the organization would do in the face of these scenarios. Is the more likely outcome that they're going to get rid of it entirely or seek to get rid of it entirely, or will it be like slow chipping away? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think that they would get rid of it entirely. It's hard to imagine that there wouldn't be outcry, not only...
It's hard to imagine invading Greenland, too, but here we are.
Well, I mean, I think that this is the thing, right? Like, what we know from Trump 1.0 is there are a lot of things that are going to be said. Just outlandish, huge outlandish things. And I think since we've seen that before, what is it that we need to focus on? Like, what is the real sort of process and steps in front of us that really could happen? And where are the actual things that we need to worry about? Trump has said he wants to make Canada the 51st state, right? Like, I just don't see that happen. Canadians are probably not going to let that happen. And so in there with, home rule, the reality of it is Congress would have to have a plan to take over a municipal government with a huge budget, a whole set of laws. I'm pretty sure that they don't want to be bothered by trash pickup or potholes and if they do, this is where I say the outcry, not just from DC residents, like you would have an entire congressional body that was elected by their constituents to deal with issues relevant to their own states. Like that's why we have Congress. And so I don't think wholesale, but I do think looking at the chipping away and also what are the things that might put us back in sort of that receivership. I'm not sure sort of a commission body would work again because that's a lot of more congressional oversight than is currently going on.
Right.
And these things take time too. Time might be one of the best things on our side.
Historically, this kind of chipping away has mostly involved like kind of hot button social issues of the day, drug legalization, same-sex marriage, et cetera. Because I agree with you that I think constituents of these people are going to say like, the hell are you guys doing jerking around with trash pickup and stuff? But what do you think are the often outlier issues which are likely to be targets? And what are you doing to prepare for that?
Yeah, the hot button issues like we've seen in the past are going to be hot button issues. Sort of what do we see at the national level? And those might be the hot button issues that we need to pay attention to here in DC. And so those issues, immigration enforcement, perhaps retaliatory prosecution that might come from, a Trump administration and his attorney. We might think about, militarization of protest here in the District of Columbia. Of course, abortion rights and LGBT rights. I think those are the ones that sort of rise to the top.
And then historically, there's nothing to stop members of Congress from inserting a rider, to say no drag queens allowed in public libraries or like that. I mean, there's sort of like absurdly small and yet like symbolically horrible things.
In this last one, I'm losing the number, but it was like, 38, 48 different riders. And some of them were, to abolish our no right turn on red or to rename a street. Right. So you have those absurd ones. I think we can anticipate quite a few of them. We still sort of have the solid two that keep going through of, marijuana and no use of Medicaid funds for abortion.
But bottom line is you as a leader of an organization that primarily works through litigation to stop assaults on civil liberties. There's nothing you can particularly do about that kind of rider like marijuana.
No, we are the local affiliate of the National ACLU, so we really are deep in DC educating people about their rights, but we're also connected to the National ACLU and some of our statewide affiliates when issues do come up that relate to DC, but we know we need people in other states to reach out to their congressional members to tell them to keep their hands off DC.
So 4 years ago, this time, everyone was hot to trot, excited about the potential for a push for statehood.
Yeah.
That's still a thing that you guys are talking about, yes?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We actually have produced a document, those who care about statehood or who care about people who are in DC, that outlines how to talk to your friends and loved ones and neighbors about DC statehood and why it matters.
I mean, it seems to me like, given that they couldn't accomplish it with Democrats in power, the idea of that as a thing to be accomplished now seems pretty far-fetched. Is that like is that a good priority to have?
It is. There are priorities that have to sort of be tweaked a little bit. It is ultimately the priority to have if you're here in DC, because it unlocks every other right that we have. Without statehood, we do not have full voting rights in a body that oversees, our democracy. And so it is the ultimate. Now, I would say the charge, people talk about statehood. And when they talk about statehood, they talk about like full statehood. And really what we're talking about here is statehood as a priority has two pieces. It is the proactive passage of a DC statehood bill that gives us full statehood. But then the other piece of this is really protecting the limited self-governance that we have currently. And so it remains a priority, both in that proactive way and in that reactive way to protect what we already have.
Monica, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
That's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.